She buried him in her heart 7 years ago. Not because he died, but because he told the entire kingdom she had. She rebuilt herself from the wreckage. She raised a son alone, in exile, in silence, without a single word of explanation from the man who had sent her away. She made peace with it. She did. She was very good at making peace with things that had no peace in them. And then her son, her 6-year-old son with his father's green eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, looked up at her one morning and said, "Mama, I want to find my papa." And her peace shattered like it had never been real at all. This is the story of what happens when the truth is 7 years late. When a child decides to do what his parents were too broken to do themselves. And when the most feared alpha in the kingdom is brought to his knees not by war, not by politics, but by a small boy who already knows exactly who he is. My name is Sansa. Welcome to Sansa Romance Oracle. And this story is called He Told the Entire Kingdom She Was Dead. Prologue. 7 years ago. The night he sent her away, the messenger died in Kyle's arms just before midnight. It was not a clean death. It was the kind of death that came from running too far and too fast with an arrow already in your side, because the message was more important than the blood, and the man had understood that perfectly. Kale held him until the end. He did not look away. He owed him that much. The message had been simple. 3 sentences. The enemy had learned who Sira was. They knew she was his Luna. They were coming for her before the week was out, and they would not be coming quietly. Kale sat in the dark for a long time after that. He was not a man who panicked. He had led armies through 3 wars without losing his footing, without letting fear reach past the place where it could affect his thinking. Fear was information, nothing more. You used it and you moved on. But this was Sira. He went to her chambers himself. He did not send a guard. She was awake when he arrived, which did not surprise him. She had always slept lightly, always known when something was wrong before he told her. She sat up when he came through the door, and she looked at his face, and she did not ask questions. She simply waited. That was one of the things he loved most about her. She never asked questions before he was ready to answer them. He sat beside her on the bed and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" he said. "Tonight." She nodded once. And then she began to pack. It took her 18 minutes to gather everything that mattered. She had always been efficient. He had always found it one of the most extraordinary things about her. The way she cut straight to the heart of any situation, without wasted motion, without wasted words. When she was done, she turned to face him. He had planned what he was going to say. He had practiced it on the walk to her chambers. He was going to tell her it was temporary, that it would be weeks at most, that he would send word through his most trusted man, through Cassian. The moment it was safe for her to come home, he was going to tell her to wait for the word. He was going to tell her to trust him. He said all of those things, and then he pulled her close and held her in a way that communicated everything the words had not. Everything he was not capable of saying out loud with an enemy at the door, and a war still unsettled, and an entire kingdom depending on him to be something other than a man who was terrified of losing the one person in the world who made the weight of it bearable. She pressed her face against his chest. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But she held on for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and he understood what that meant. He walked her to the carriage himself. She did not look back when she climbed inside. He understood that too. Looking back would have made it impossible. He watched the carriage until it disappeared into the dark, and he told himself she would be safe. He told himself he would send word through Cassian the moment the threat was neutralized. He told himself she would wait. He told himself she would understand. He was right about only one of those things. And he would not know which one for 7 years. Chapter 1: The Boy with His Father's Eyes. Sarah had rebuilt her life the way you rebuilt anything after a flood. Not by pretending the flood had not happened. Not by mourning every day what the water had taken. But by beginning, carefully and methodically, from the ground up. By deciding that what she built next would be stronger. By refusing, every single morning, to let what was gone take the place of what was here. What was here was Luca. Luca, who was 6 years old and had inherited his father's green eyes and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure. Which meant he was quietly relentless in a way that could make grown men feel they had lost an argument they did not realize they were having. Luca, who had recently discovered the word papa and was using it with what Sarah could only describe as focused intention. It had started 3 weeks ago. He had come home from the market with old Tibbin's granddaughter, who had a father who carved her name into her shoes, and a grandfather who told stories about her father's father, and a whole long chain of people behind her that Luca had apparently spent considerable time thinking about. He had sat at the kitchen table that evening, eaten his supper in thoughtful silence, and then looked up at Sarah and said, "I have a papa somewhere, don't I?" Sarah had kept her face very calm. She was excellent at keeping her face very calm. "Yes," she had said, "you do. Is he alive?" A pause that she did not allow to last long enough to mean anything. "I don't know," she had said. This was not quite true. But it was the version of the truth she could live with. Luca had considered this for a moment, with the grave seriousness he applied to most things. And then he had nodded once, as if confirming something he had already decided, and gone back to his supper. He had not raised it again for 10 days. She had thought, cautiously, that the conversation had passed. She had been wrong. This morning, he had arrived at the breakfast table with a look on his face that she recognized immediately. It was the same look he had worn at age 4, when he had decided he was going to learn to fish. And nothing she said made any difference. And he had simply shown up at the river every morning for 2 weeks until he caught something. It was the look of a decision that had already been made. "Mama," he had said, reaching for his bread with both hands, "I have decided that my papa is alive." Sarah had set down her cup. "Have you?" she had said. "Yes. And I would like to find him." He looked up at her with those eyes, those impossible eyes that she had spent 6 years not looking at directly, because looking directly at them was like looking into the sun. "I think he would want to know about me. Wouldn't you, if you were him?" Sarah had no answer for this that was both true and safe. So she had said, "Finish your breakfast." And Luca had accepted this with the patience of someone who had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He finished his breakfast. Then he put on his coat and went outside to play, as if the conversation had been entirely ordinary. Sira stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and for one unguarded moment, before she could stop herself, she looked directly at the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular way he tilted his head when he was thinking. 7 years, she told herself. Let it go. She was very good at letting it go. She had been practicing for 7 years. She picked up Luca's empty bowl and washed it, and did not let herself feel anything at all. That night, after he was asleep, she looked at his face in the candlelight. His jaw, his brow. Those impossible green eyes, closed now, lashes dark against his cheek. She made herself stop looking. She was very good at that. 7 years of practice. Chapter 2, The Alpha Who Stopped Hoping. The council meeting had been running for 2 hours, and Kyle was aware of every minute of it, in the way a man was aware of something that was wasting his time without being important enough to end. Lord Fenwick was still speaking. Lord Fenwick was always still speaking. KL had appointed him to the council 7 years ago on the basis of his considerable knowledge of border trade routes, and had since discovered that Lord Fenwick's knowledge of border trade routes came with an approximately equal amount of opinions about everything else, delivered at length with great confidence and without any evident awareness that the Alpha had stopped listening. Kale kept his face attentive. He had perfected this expression over years of governance. It conveyed attention without commitment. It invited no follow-up questions. Beside him, Cassian leaned over and said something quiet and precise about the Eastern supply chain, as he always did, at exactly the right moment, providing the information that moved things forward. Cal had relied on him for this for years. For everything. Cassian had been beside him since before the war, had seen every difficult decision and every difficult consequence, and had remained steady through all of it. He was the closest thing Kyle had to a brother. When the council finally ended, Kale walked the long corridor back to his private quarters alone. He did this every day. His guards knew to follow at a distance. He needed the minutes between the council room and his chambers to move through the transition, to leave the Alpha and find whatever remained of the man underneath. He stopped outside the locked door. It sat between his study and his sleeping chambers, an unremarkable door. Dark wood, simple iron handle. Nothing about it announced what was inside. He did not need to unlock it. He had the contents memorized. He had them memorized the way he had the sound of her voice memorized, the exact particular quality of her laugh. He kept them because he had no other choice, not because he allowed himself to want them. He stood outside the door for 60 seconds. He counted them. He did not go inside. Then he continued to his chambers, washed the council from his hands, and sat at his desk and worked until the candles burned low. He did not think about her. He had gotten very good at not thinking about her. And if there were moments, very occasional, very brief, always at the end of a long day when his defenses were at their lowest, when he sat in his chair and looked at nothing and wondered, not with hope. He had given up hope, but simply as a fact that lived in him, whether he wanted it to or not, where she was, whether she was warm, whether she ever thought about this corridor, this house, this life they had been building. Those moments he locked away as quickly as he had unlocked them. 60 seconds. No more. He picked up the next document and kept working. At the end of the corridor, Cassian stood in the doorway of his own study and watched the light under Kyle's door remain steady and still. He has been counting them for 7 years, Cassian thought. The seconds outside that door. He smiled. Good. Chapter 3. Luca goes first. The soldiers had very impressive horses. Lucas stood at the edge of the main road and assessed them with the serious attention he gave to everything that mattered. 6 horses, gray and dark bay, and one very large black one that was clearly the leader's horse because it was the biggest and the rider sat on it, like he was used to people looking at him. They wore armor with a crest on it, a silver tree on a black ground. Luca had seen that crest before. He went back to the house at a run, pulled up the loose floorboard under his bed, and lifted out the small tin he had found 18 months ago when he was exploring places his mother thought he hadn't found yet. Inside the tin there was a coin. Old. Silver. With a tree on it. A silver tree on a black ground. He put the coin in his pocket. He went back to the road. The patrol had stopped at the well for water. Luca walked up to the patrol leader's horse and looked up at the man on it. The man was large and serious, looking, with a scar on his chin and the kind of face that people probably found very intimidating. Luca was not intimidated. He had a mission. "Excuse me," he said. The patrol leader looked down. His expression shifted into the particular confusion that adults often had when Luca talked to them, as though they were not quite sure what they were dealing with. "Can I help you, child?" the man said. "I need to send a message to the Alpha King," Luca said. He reached into his pocket and held up the coin. "I found this in my mother's things. She keeps it very hidden, which means it's important. It has the same tree as your armor. And the Alpha King is from Ashvale, so I think he might be my papa." The patrol leader stared at him. He stared for a considerably long time. Luca was accustomed to this. He waited patiently. The man's gaze moved over Luca's face in a way that was different from ordinary looking. It was more careful than that, more specific. His eyes went to Luca's jaw, his eyes, the particular set of his brow. The patrol leader went very still. "What is your name?" he said. His voice had changed. "Luca Vallon," said Luca. "What's yours?" The man did not answer immediately. He was looking at Luca's face with an expression that Luca could not quite read. It was not unkind. It was something between shock and recognition, and there was something in it that looked a little like grief. "Tell me your mother's name," the man said. Luca considered this. His mother had told him to be careful about strangers, but this man wore the crest from the coin, and Luca had a mission. "Sarah," he said. "Her name is Sarah." The patrol leader closed his eyes for a moment. Then he looked at his second in command and said something very quietly that Luca couldn't hear. The second man nodded and immediately separated from the group, turning his horse east toward the main road, moving fast. The patrol leader looked back down at Luca. "I need you to stay close to me," he said. "Can you do that?" "Yes," said Luca. He paused. "Mama is going to be very cross," he added. "She does not know I'm doing this, but she will understand later." Grown-ups always understand later. The patrol leader made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He climbed down from his horse. "She might be cross with me too," he said quietly. He didn't seem to be talking to Luca anymore. "Are you going to take me to my papa?" Luca asked. The man looked at him. Something in his face was very careful, very considered. "I'm going to make sure the right person knows you're here," he said. "That's the best I can do right now." Luca accepted this. It was a reasonable answer. He was going to find his papa. He had decided. And Luca, when he had decided something, was very difficult to stop. He stood beside the patrol leader's horse and waited, with the patience of someone who had never once doubted that the thing he was waiting for was coming. Chapter 4. The rider's message. Kyle was reviewing trade reports when the rider arrived. He heard the horse before the knock at his study door, heard the pace of it, the urgency in the hoofbeats, the way it cut short before the usual slowing distance that indicated ordinary news. This rider had been moving fast the whole way and had not begun to slow until the last possible moment. "Come in," he said. The rider was one of the border patrol, young, breathing hard from the ride. He was the kind of young soldier who had not yet learned to keep his expression controlled in front of his alpha, and his expression right now was doing something complicated that Kale could not immediately categorize. "Your Majesty," the young man said, and then stopped. Started again. "There is a child," he said, "in the border village, Eastern Quarter. He says he has a message for you." Kyle looked up from the reports. Children sent messages to the Alpha of Ashvale with some regularity. It was not unusual. He dealt with it through his secretariat. He was about to say this when the rider continued. He gave his name as Luca Valen. The rider said, "Valen. He says his mother's name is Sira." The trade reports made no sound when they fell from Kyle's hands. He did not notice them fall. The rider was still speaking. Something about a coin, about the crest, about green eyes and a jaw that the patrol leader had described in terms that had made the rider's commanding officer send him at a dead gallop rather than a steady pace. Kale was not hearing the words anymore. He was hearing the name, Sira. Valen, which had been the false surname he had arranged for her. Valen, which meant she had used it. Which meant she had arrived safely. Which meant she had been there, in the border village, all this time. All this time. And a child named Luca. 6 years old, the rider was saying. Unusual green eyes. Kale stood up from his desk. He was aware of Cassian entering the room behind the rider. Because Cassian always moved toward urgency, the way other people moved away from it, and the rider's arrival had not been subtle. He was aware of Cassian very specifically in a way he could not have articulated. He did not look at him. "Have the horses ready in 10 minutes, he said. Small guard. No announcement. Your Majesty, Cassian began. 10 minutes, Kale said. His voice came out flat and final, the voice that ended conversations. The voice that made men stop mid-sentence and rethink whatever they had been about to say. Cassian stopped. Kyle walked out. At the doorway, behind him, Cassian stood very still for a moment. The warm, easy expression he wore so naturally, the one that had made him trusted and beloved in this court for 7 years, had gone somewhere else entirely. His jaw was tight. His eyes were calculating something at speed. Then the expression came back, easy and warm and perfectly arranged, and he followed. Chapter 5, she sees him first. It was market day, which meant the square was full. Sarah moved through it the way she had moved through everything for 7 years. Efficiently, without wasted motion. Eyes forward. Her awareness spread out in all directions, the way a wolf's awareness always was, reading each face, each posture, each small shift in the crowd's attention. She had almost reached the grain merchant when the crowd's attention shifted. She felt it before she identified it. A collective turning, a realignment. The way a room of people oriented toward a new gravitational center without realizing they were doing it. She looked up. The horses came through the northern entrance to the square. 6 of them. Dark, well-bred, moving with the controlled precision of animals trained for more than travel. The riders wore dark armor. And at the front, on the largest horse, was a man she had not seen in 7 years. Her wolf knew before her mind did. Her wolf had always known him. That was the thing about a bond. It did not care about time. It did not care about distance, or silence, or 7 years of careful, deliberate forgetting. It simply recognized, at a frequency below thought, below decision, below everything she had built to protect herself. He was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps he had simply grown into his size in a way that 7 years of war and governance had finished. His dark hair was loose. His face was harder, scarred in a place it had not been scarred before. A line across his cheekbone that had not existed the last time she had stood close enough to see such things. He was scanning the square, looking for something, looking for someone. His eyes swept faces, one after another, methodical, the way he did everything. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was holding himself very tightly controlled. She knew that jaw. She had studied it for 3 years. She knew every particular tension of it. His eyes reached hers. Time did something strange. She had prepared for this. She had told herself, in the abstract, that she was prepared for this, that she had processed everything there was to process, that 7 years was long enough to build a wall solid enough to hold. She had been wrong. He saw her. She saw him see her. Across the square, across 7 years of silence and absence and grief and anger, something passed between them that had no language, because the bond did not use language. She picked up her basket. She turned and walked in the opposite direction with perfect, practiced calm. She was shaking so hard, she could not feel her hands. She kept her eyes on the road in front of her. She counted the stones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She focused on the weight of the basket, on the cold air, on the sound of her own footsteps. She heard him call her name, her real name. The name she had not heard spoken aloud in 7 years. The name that belonged to the life she had been forced to leave behind. The name that, in his voice, sounded exactly as it had always sounded, low and certain and specific to her in a way no other word ever had. She did not stop walking. She counted the stones. She did not look back. She was very good at not looking back. 7 years of practice. Chapter 6. The boy who already decided. Kale found the child standing in the market square precisely where the patrol leader had said he would be. He had been told what to expect. He had been given the description. Green eyes, dark hair, 6 years old. Sends messages to kings as though it is a perfectly ordinary thing to do. He had thought he was prepared. He was not prepared. The boy was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the horses with an expression of concentrated assessment. He looked at each horse in turn, then at each rider, and then his gaze landed on Kale and stayed there. He did not move. He did not call out. He simply looked. Kale dismounted. He crossed the square at a pace that was slower than he wanted, because something was happening in his chest that he did not have a name for. Something that made measured movement very difficult, and he could not afford to lose his footing. Not here. Not in front of this child. He stopped in front of him. The boy tilted his head back to look up at him. He had his mother's directness, her particular way of looking at someone, as though she was cataloging them and had not yet decided what to do with the information. He also had green eyes that were the exact shade of the eyes Kale saw in every reflective surface, every single day. The boy looked at him for a long, serious moment. "Are you the Alpha King?" he said. "Yes," said Kale. The boy reached into his pocket and produced a silver coin. The Ashvale crest. Small, old. His mother had kept it. All this time, she had kept it. Kale's throat closed. "I found this in my mother's things," the boy said. He held it out matter-of-factly for Kale's inspection. "She keeps it very hidden, so it must be important to her." His voice was calm, pragmatic. A small person's voice, doing its best to be the voice of a reasonable adult. "Are you my papa?" he asked. Kyle could not speak. The words were there. He knew what they were. He knew what the answer was. But the mechanism required to produce them appeared to have stopped working. And he stood in the square in front of this small boy with his silver coin and his green eyes and simply could not find his voice. The boy regarded him. "That's all right," he said simply. "I already know that you are." He put the coin back in his pocket. He stepped forward. He took Kale's hand. He took it with the easy, uncomplicated confidence of someone who had decided long ago that this was where his hand belonged and was not remotely surprised to have arrived here at last. Kyle's hand closed around his son's. Behind him, he was dimly aware of his guards. He was dimly aware that some of them had found reasons to look elsewhere. He was dimly aware that the square continued around them, that the market continued, that the world was still doing all the ordinary things the world did. None of it registered. He was on one knee in the dirt of the market square, at his son's eye level, and his son was looking at him with Syrah's eyes and Syrah's directness, and something in his face that was entirely his own, entirely new, entirely a person Kale had not known existed until 43 minutes ago, and now could not imagine having existed without. He held Luca's hand and could not remember a single battle that had required this much courage. Chapter 7, 7 Years of Silence. She agreed to see him because of Luca. That was the truth of it. She had come back to the house and found Luca already holding the Alpha King's hand as they came through the market, and Luca had looked at her with those eyes and said, "Mama, this is my papa. I told you he was alive." And what could she do? What could she possibly do? She waited until Luca was settled with the patrol leader's second, who had produced from somewhere a carved wooden horse that Luca had immediately named and begun to introduce to various people. Then she led Kale inside. They sat at the kitchen table. Her kitchen table, in her house, in the life she had built from the rubble of the one he had taken from her. The pot of tea she had made that morning was still on the stove. The fire was low. Everything was ordinary, and nothing was ordinary, and she kept her hands flat on the table so she would not have to think about what they wanted to do. She had spent 7 years being angry. She was still angry. She did not intend to pretend otherwise. he did not pretend either. He looked at her across the table, and his face did not perform anything. It simply held what was there, the exhaustion of 7 years, the weight of what he had not known. Something that looked like grief and guilt together, wearing each other's clothes. He told her why he had done what he did. She already knew the reason. She had constructed it herself over years, when the anger was manageable enough to think clearly. She had known, on her better days, that a man who had loved her the way he had loved her had not sent her away out of indifference. She had known there was a reason. Knowing a thing and hearing it said aloud were different things. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "If you sent me away to protect me," she said, "if you arranged everything and told the kingdom I was dead to draw out the threat," she stopped. "Then why didn't you come back? Why didn't you come for me?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "I sent word, through Cassian. The moment the threat was neutralized, I sent word through Cassian that it was safe, that I was coming, that I wanted you to come home." The air in the room changed. She had not moved, but something inside her had gone very still, very focused. In the way it went when her wolf identified something it did not yet understand, but recognized as important. "Cassian," she said. Yes, she had not heard from Cassian. Not once. Not a word in 7 years. She had assumed Kyle had not sent any word. She had built her entire 7 years on that assumption. Kyle's expression shifted. He was watching her face. She was watching his. They were both following the same thought toward the same destination, and neither of them wanted to arrive there, because arriving there meant something that neither of them was ready for. "Cassian," she said again. He was quiet. "I never received anything," she said. "Not one word. Not in 7 years." The silence between them was not empty. It was full of something very large. She could feel it pressing against the walls of the room. All the space it took up, all the years it represented. She looked at Cale's face. He looked at hers. "Cassian," he said, very quietly, and it was not a question. She had spent 7 years being angry at the right man for the wrong reasons. That was almost worse. Chapter 8. What Cassian built in the dark. Kyle did not confront Cassian immediately. He had learned over years of governance that the worst way to expose the truth was to charge directly at it. The truth had a way of hiding behind the confrontation itself. You gave a man the opportunity to deny, to deflect, to construct a new surface over what he had buried, and then the truth was deeper than before, and you were further from it. Instead, Cal went quietly. He had resources. He had always had resources. He simply had not, until now, thought to use any of them in the direction of the man who stood at his right hand. What he found took 3 days. It was methodical, careful. Years of careful. Cassian had not been careless, because he had not needed to be careful. There had been no one looking, no reason for anyone to look, and a man who was universally trusted was a man who was never examined. The message had been intercepted. Not lost, intercepted. There were records. If you knew where to look, and Cale had people who knew where to look. People Cassian had never managed, because they reported only to Kyle directly. The message had been intercepted. A second had been sent in its place, something that would read to Sarah as silence, as choice, as a man who had weighed his options, and decided not to return for the woman he had hidden in the border village. 7 years of that silence, built in 3 days. Chaol also found the succession plans. They were not obvious. Cassian had not been obvious. But they were there, threaded through 7 years of quietly positioned allies, of laws suggested and gently passed, of precedents established, of the kind of patient architecture that required a man with foresight, and no hair standing in his way. He had needed Chaol alive. A dead alpha created too much chaos. But a living alpha without a Luna, without an heir, grieving and isolated and increasingly dependent on his most trusted advisor. That alpha was a figurehead. That alpha, in time, became a signature on documents that Cassian directed. Luca's existence had ended it. A 6-year-old boy in a border village had walked up to a patrol and introduced himself, and 7 years of careful architecture had begun to come apart in an afternoon. Chaol confronted him that evening. He went alone. He did not want witnesses for this. He was not sure what he was going to do, and he did not want anyone near him while he was not sure. Cassian was in his study. He looked up when Chaol came in, and his expression did its usual warm, easy thing. And then it read the room, and it stopped. He did not deny it. This somehow was the worst thing. He looked at Chaol for a moment, and then he sat back in his chair. And he said, "You should understand why." Chaol said nothing. "You were going to destroy everything," Cassian said. His voice was even, reasonable. The voice of a man explaining something that should, to any sensible listener, be obvious. You were going to go back for her. You were going to drop the war, drop the campaign, drop the careful balance you had built, and go after one woman in a border village. I have watched you. I know what she does to your thinking. I know what she costs you." He paused. "I did not take her from you," he said. "I gave you a kingdom." He said it warmly. He said it with the conviction of a man who had told himself this story so many times that it had become the truth inside his own head. A man who had looked at his own betrayal and found it entirely reasonable, entirely justified, entirely an act of care for the thing he served. He believed it. That, perhaps more than anything, was what made Kyle's hands clench at his sides. He looked at this man he had called brother for 15 years. This man who had stood beside him in 3 wars. Who had held him up in the worst nights, and the worst decisions, and the years before, and after Sarah, when everything had felt impossible and too heavy to carry. This man who had taken 7 years from them with a single intercepted letter and a carefully constructed silence. "Be grateful it was me," Cassian said. "Anyone else would have had her killed." He said it, as if this was the point, as if the alternative he had not chosen was the kindness. Chaol walked out and closed the door behind him, and stood in the corridor and breathed. The worst part was not the betrayal. The worst part was that for 7 years, Chaol had called this man brother. Chapter 9, she decides. Sarah sat by the fire after Luca was asleep and let herself think. She had been given the full account that afternoon. One of Chaol's trusted men had come to the house with documents, careful and specific, and had gone through everything with her. The intercepted message, the false silence, the 7 years of it. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult things. Without rushing toward any particular feeling, without forcing a resolution before one was ready to arrive. The anger was still there. Of course it was still there. Anger did not dissolve simply because its object had changed. The 7 years had happened. She had lived them. She had raised a son alone in a village far from everything she had known, and she had made something real and good from that. But she had also been alone in a way that went very deep. And the loneliness did not stop being real simply because the cause of it turned out to be a man she had never met rather than the man she had trusted. The anger was still there. But underneath it, something else was shifting. She thought about the locked room. She thought about what Kyle's soldier had told her, quietly and without drama, that the Alpha had not taken a Luna in 7 years. That the court had been quietly concerned for some time. That he had ruled well, efficiently, without apparent weakness. And that there was a room in his private quarters that no one was allowed to enter, and that he went there alone, briefly, and always seemed to count the seconds. She thought about that for a long time. She heard small footsteps. Luca appeared in the doorway in his nightclothes, his dark hair disordered from sleep, one hand rubbing at his eye. He looked at her with his father's eyes and her own expression. The one she made when she had already decided something and was working out the best way to say it. He crossed the room and climbed into her lap without asking. He settled himself against her chest with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had done this 10,000 times and never once doubted the welcome. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mama." He waited for me too, didn't he? She did not answer. He waited for me too, Luca said with certainty. Just like you. He just didn't know where to look. Sira closed her eyes. She pressed her face into his hair and breathed him in. Soap and pine and the particular warm scent of her child. Her wonderful, infuriating, extraordinary child, who had done in one afternoon what she had not been able to do in 7 years. She sat with him until he fell asleep again in her arms. Then she laid him carefully on the cot by the fire, tucked the blanket around him, and stood up. She had 3 things to say to Kyle. She went to find him. He was outside. She had known he would be. He was sitting on the low wall at the edge of the yard, looking at the dark. He heard her come out. She could tell by the way his shoulders changed, but he did not turn around. He was giving her the choice of whether to approach. He had always been good at that. She had always resented how good he was at that. She sat beside him on the wall. She told him the first thing. She said, "I don't forgive you. Not yet." She kept her voice even. "Not because I think you did anything wrong. I know now that you didn't. But I spent 7 years building a story about who you were and what you chose, and I cannot dismantle 7 years in 3 days. The story needs time to come down." He nodded. She told him the second thing. She said, "I understand what you did and why you did it and what it cost you. I understand all of it. And understanding is not the same as forgiving. I need you to know the difference." He turned to look at her. In the dark, his face was very quiet. Not relieved, not reaching for anything she had not offered. Simply listening, with the whole of his attention, the way he had always listened. "I know," he said. "I have always known. Take whatever time you need." He paused. "I will be here." A breath. "I was always here." She looked at him. She did not say the third thing. Not yet. The third thing was still too close to the place where the wall was thinnest, and the wall needed to come down properly. She would not climb over the rubble. She would wait until the path was clear. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked away, at the dark yard, at the tree at the edge of it, at the frost on the ground. "Good," she said quietly. "Then that is where we start." Chapter 10. What Luca knew all along. Luca had views about the palace. He had communicated these views clearly and at length to his father, who had listened to all of them with an expression that Luca found very satisfying. It was the expression of a person who was taking you seriously. Most adults did not take Luca seriously when he expressed views about architecture. His father did. The throne was too large. Luca had said so on his first viewing of it, standing in the great hall with his hands on his hips. It made the person sitting in it look smaller, not larger, which was the opposite of what you wanted from a throne. His father had looked at it, looked at Luca, and said, "I have never liked it either." No one had ever said this to Luca about the throne before, and it made him feel that he and his father had very good taste. The training yard, on the other hand, was excellent. It was large and well organized and smelled satisfyingly of sawdust and effort. There were targets and weapons racks, and an area for working in wolf form. Luca had examined all of this with great thoroughness and said it was the best training yard he had ever seen, which was true. Although he had only seen 2 training yards in his life, his father had laughed at this. It was a good laugh, low and warm and very real. Luca had heard his mother laugh with the same realness and had always considered it one of the best sounds in the world. He was collecting them, his father's particular sounds. The way he said Luca's name, still slightly careful around the edges, as if he was not yet used to being allowed to say it. The quiet sound he made when he was thinking. The way he went still when Luca took his hand. Luca was compiling these things into the version of his father he had always known was real, and finding, with considerable satisfaction, that they matched. On the 4th afternoon, his father took him to the eastern courtyard. The good one, with the old pine trees and the flat, clear ground and no wind. Luca had been wondering when this would happen. "Can you feel it?" his father asked. He had crouched down to Luca's level. He did this naturally now, without the first day carefulness. He smelled like pine and cold air, and the particular warm scent that Luca had decided was simply what Papa smelled like. Luca closed his eyes. It was like a second heartbeat. That was the best way he could describe it. Not his own heartbeat. Something underneath it. Older, quieter, waiting. "Yes," Luca said. His father nodded. "Don't force it. Just let it come." Luca stood in the cold courtyard and breathed. It started in his hands. A warmth that was not temperature. A feeling of something that had always been there, very patient, simply waiting for the moment when it would be noticed and invited. The way water waited in the earth. It happened between one breath and the next. He was standing, and then he was not standing. And the world was much larger and much more interesting and full of sense he had no names for yet. He shook himself, because that seemed like the right thing to do. His paws were very small. He looked at them. He looked up. His father was watching him. The stillness on his face was absolute. He had gone completely motionless. The way you went motionless when you were trying very hard not to disturb something rare and fragile and extraordinary. The expression on his face was something Luca had not seen before. He would think about it later, when he had more words for things. He would decide it was the face of a person seeing something they had given up hoping for. Luca scrambled across the snow and bounced against his father's knee, because it was there, and he was there, and that was excellent. His father's hand came down on his head, gentle and enormous and warm. From the doorway, his mother was watching. Luca looked at her. He looked at his father. He shifted back, because he had things to say, and you needed a mouth to say them properly. He sat in the snow in the cold courtyard and looked between them. "I knew," he announced. He said it with the immense satisfaction of a person whose plan had worked exactly as intended. "I told you I knew." Neither of them argued with him. He was right. He had always been right. Epilogue, the third thing she had to say 6 months later. Sira stood in the great hall of Ashvale and watched her son hold court. He was not supposed to be holding court. He was supposed to be at his lessons. But the court herald had been present, and Luca had developed very specific views about the proper way to address a future king. And the herald had apparently decided that the most efficient response was simply to listen. 3 members of the council were also listening. They did not appear to have chosen this. It had simply become the situation they were in. Sira watched Luca's hands move as he made a point, emphatic and precise. His father's green eyes bright, her own stubbornness in every line of him, and felt something warm and completely ordinary settle in her chest. This was her life now. This impossible, ordinary, extraordinary life. She was Luna again. Not because the treaty required it. Not because anyone had asked it of her, or arranged it, or told her what was necessary for the good of the kingdom. She was Luna because she had chosen it. On a morning 3 months ago, when the last of the wall had finally come down the way she had known it would, quietly, without drama, like snow melting in spring. Because that was how walls came down when you had not forced them. She had walked into Kyle's study that morning and told him she was staying. He had not said, "I told you so." He had not said, "Finally." He had not made her feel small for the time it had taken, or performed any relief at her. He had simply said, "Good." And then he had gone back to his documents. And she had sat across the desk from him. And they had worked in the same room, in silence for 2 hours. The way they had always worked best, with no need to fill the space with anything it didn't already hold. That had been that. She heard his step behind her now. The specific weight and rhythm of it that she had rebuilt from memory and found. When she had access to the original again, exactly as she remembered. Kale came to stand beside her. He looked at Luca. The particular look he had, soft and helpless, and utterly unlike the face he wore for councils and armies, and the general business of running a kingdom. The look that was entirely for this, for the small, impossible person who had rearranged both their lives with nothing more than a coin and a certainty. "Your son," said Kyle, "is explaining succession law to Lord Fenwick." "Lord Fenwick," said Sira, "could probably use the education." He made the sound she had been collecting. Low and warm and real. She put her hand into her pocket. Her fingers found the coin, the Ashvale crest, small and silver and worn smooth on one side from years of being held in the dark when she needed to hold something. She turned to face him. She had told him the first thing and the second thing in the border village yard, in the dark with the frost on the ground. She held out the coin. He looked at it. old, small, worn smooth, his crest. He looked at her. She had kept it. Through 7 years of silence and anger and exile, and the careful, deliberate work of convincing herself it meant nothing, she had kept it. She had moved 3 times. She had rebuilt everything she owned from scratch. She had kept the coin. He knew what it meant. He had always known. He simply needed her to be ready to say it. He took the coin. He took her hand around it. He held both. In the great hall, Luca had concluded his address and was now demanding to know if someone could bring him bread, because explaining things was hungry work. The herald looked overwhelmed. The council members looked at each other. Kyle's fingers tightened around hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She felt it through the bond. The thing the bond had been telling her since the moment she had seen him ride into the market square. The thing she had been almost ready to hear for 6 months and was now entirely ready to hear. In the next room, Luca's voice, clear and imperious and bright as anything. Now she was here. She was home. Outro. Sansa Romance Oracle. That is the end of He told the entire kingdom she was dead. If Luca broke your heart, open even a little bit. You are exactly the kind of person I make these for. If you are new here, welcome. There are more stories just like this one on the way for Sansa Romance Oracle. Stories about children who know things grown ups are too afraid to admit. About broken people who deserve to be whole. About love that survives the things that should have ended it. Stay with me. I will see you for the next one.